Thank you for joining us at Columbia University's Sustainability Space Lecture Series. Today's event is hosted by the Sustainability Management Student Association, commonly referred to as SUMASA. My name is Kyla Aiuto, and I'm a master's candidate in the Sustainability Management program here at Columbia. Today, I'm joined by three panelists to discuss the importance of leading with integrity in corporate governance to achieve sustainable objectives, particularly without oversight from government regulation. We will also talk about the recent election results and the impact they may have on those working in the sustainability space. So we first welcome Devry Vorwerk, CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies, a company she recently founded to inspire businesses to courageously serve humanity. Devry previously served as the Chief Communications Officer and Corporate Vice President of Global Affairs for Cargill, where she was the youngest elected corporate officer in the company's over 150-year history. She was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in 2014 and was selected as one of the world's top 100 communicators by the Holmes Report. We also welcome my friend David Curran, who serves as the Chief Sustainability and ESG Officer at Weiss, one of the world's largest international law firms, representing major publicly and privately held corporations, financial institutions, and asset managers. Dave leads many popular thought leadership conversations with senior executives in the risk and governance space to bring light to ESG issues into leadership circles. And Lisette Duran joins us as well from Weiss, where she works on a variety of environmental, social, and governance issues for corporate clients. Lisette is also heavily involved in diversity and inclusion efforts at Weiss, and she sits on a number of task forces dedicated to improving associate life at the firm. Prior to joining Weiss, Lisette actually received her JD from Columbia Law School, and she was an editor of the Columbia Law Review. We are absolutely delighted to host the three of you here with us this morning, and thank you for waking up so early to make this happen, particularly you, Devry. I know you're a couple hours behind us.
Yeah.
So to begin, I'll ask you to please introduce yourselves, tell us what you've been working on, and tell us how you ended up where you are now. Afterwards, we're going to jump into a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. And audience members, you are welcome to post your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll have a good bit of time at the end to go through those. And with that, I'd like to ask Devry to please kick us off.
Great. Well, good morning to those of you that are up with us early. And if you're joining us from somewhere across the globe, good afternoon and good evening. It's a delight to be here with you. And thank you, Kyla, and to your entire team for putting this, what I think is a timely session together, given the results of the last week here in the United States. Again, Kyla mentioned that I lead a company that is focused on, we say, inspiring business to courageously serve humanity. There's a lot in that business purpose, courage being one element that we talk with leaders about, having the courage to do the right thing and pivot the business toward more sustainable outcomes, etc. Inspiration, how do we find different ways to work with business leaders to help inspire them to personally take action to again, pivot the business. So our company, the goal of our company, quite frankly, our vision is to be the trusted partner in sustainability solutions for companies. And why are we focused on companies? It's so interesting to see those results pop up earlier in the poll, to see that you all answered the question, the force of the private sector to address the biggest issues of our time in the environmental space, the social space, and the economic space. And in my experience over the last 20 some odd years in global business and in government, we've been making that very slow march toward integrated solutions to these issues. And frankly, the reason that I stepped out of my role, and you would think it's so counterintuitive to be able to impact, at scale, being a corporate officer in a company that 70 countries on the ground invested, trading with 130. Why did I step out of such a large platform to drive change? It's because we don't have time and we've got to scale the change. And so our goal is to work across all sectors, technology, food and ag, financial services, you keep going, to introduce the toolkits and the models that can be used to very quickly get companies to focus on the sustainable development goals. So we are taking the SDGs and putting them at the center of the business strategy. No longer is it okay for a company to say, well, we've got corporate responsibility and SDGs over here. And in essence, it's about sitting with the C-suite and sitting with the boards and saying, here is your opportunity to introduce these at the beginning in the business strategy and make sure it's on your game board for future investments, whether it's mergers and acquisitions or actually divesting from unsustainable businesses, et cetera. And so that's what we do. And we're a mighty force. And I want to say hello to my small but able team. We believe that we can actually speed up solutions because we talked ahead of time, you've got all these big consulting firms that come in and make it complicated. And here's how it's done. Quite frankly, it starts with leadership courage, leadership intent, and then finding those pockets of resistance within a company and calling those out in a way that creates a safe space for the business to drive change.
And Dave, why don't we hear from you next?
Sure, and good morning, and thank you, Kyla, for the nice introduction. And I'm going to tee off on a couple of comments that Devry made because they dovetail perfectly with why I'm doing what I'm doing. But thanks to Columbia, this has been a premier program for a long time, and it's great to see that it's becoming more and more common for students to pursue this area. This is not an esoteric thing. One of the jokes that I have is, I think when I joined a law firm, I tried to assuage fears that I was a tree-hugging anarchist. And my point is, I love trees, but I don't believe in anarchy. And I think my career really as a lawyer and business person has been spent sort of at this collision point, intersection of law, business, governance, risk. There are no business decisions of any consequence at any organization. And since the people in the poll indicated that it's going to be from private industry, well, these private industries, every decision they make is gauged by risk. And a risk, it's both a qualitative and a quantitative analysis. And I left running a technology company where Kyla and I worked together because, like Devry, I thought that as much as technology is essential here and more ritualized programs, the real gap was that not everybody was at the table talking in the same language. And the lingua franca of sustainability and ESG is quite complex. It's global in nature. It's not easily codified. And at the center of this, the last person in the room in any major decision at a company is not the head of sustainability, is not the head of human resources. It's not typically the head of technology. It's the lawyers and the CFO. Having been a general counsel of publicly traded companies, I know how much control lawyers have over the board, since they're the corporate secretaries. And I thought that it was really imperative at this stage in the world that we bring lawyers to the table and have the role that they should have, rather than be boat anchors, rather than be afraid of this arena. They needed to embrace it and needed to better understand it, and to help good companies pressure test and make their programs more resilient and strengthen them. And so that's the reason we set up a very differentiated practice at Paul Weiss. So this is an advisory practice. So the key is combining advice together with complementary services like those offered by Devry, technology companies, data and analytics, and have a holistic solution. So many decisions made by companies, in particular in this arena, are made without transparency into all of the correct data, the right people, the right information is not available. So our goal is to help folks who are making these very important decisions that have long-term, if not existential impact, do it with better education. For the longest time, sustainability and ESG have been on the sidelines. They've been handled by companies, as Devry mentioned, sort of in silos, And that's just not acceptable. We have to make this change happen faster. And one of the ways is to break through the bureaucracy of companies and have them understand the business imperatives and the stakeholder requirements that go beyond, that bring the law to the table, but also go beyond the law. So I'm excited to have stood up this practice entirely remotely in the year of COVID, and an amazing team we put together, which includes Lisette. And so over to you, Lisette.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you first. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Kyla and SUMASA. And it's really a privilege to be here. And I always jump at any opportunity to come back to Columbia. I had a great time there and I met the most amazing people. So thank you again for this opportunity. Like Kyla said, I am an associate with the ESG and Sustainability Advisory Practice with Dave at Weiss. I got my bachelor's from Penn in 2009, and then I came to Columbia and graduated from the law school in 2014. And I'll say that unlike you all, who are a lot of you that sort of intentionally decided to pursue this degree and join this program, which I did some researching yesterday, seems amazing. I didn't know that I was going to do this when I left law school, right? I went to law school to be a litigator. And that's what I did. I took the bar and I joined Weiss, and I was a big law litigator. And I learned, to look at things and to look at these issues with that legal lens. What does the law say? What does the law require? And that's what we're going to do, right? And anything more creates unnecessary legal risk. And so that's sort of where we stood. I did large, complex commercial litigation. I did sweeping regulatory investigations. And we were really working with sort of the minimum. And then it wasn't until I got to do employment investigations where I got to be really go into these companies and go under the hood, look at the kinds of issues that they were dealing with, and go beyond, do these cases have merit? But think about, what is the business risk here? What is the reputational risk here? That I started thinking about these issues in a real way. And then I got, at Weiss, I started getting involved in the Associates Committee and in D&I efforts, and I saw examples of what it looks like when you do more and what the positive effects of that, reputational, legal, et cetera. Then I had the opportunity to go to MUFG Bank, and even though I hadn't worked with them as a client, I assumed with my litigator hat on that we would have conversations about merit, right? Oh, these cases come in, we can get rid of them in 6 months to a year. And for a big law litigator, that's like an afternoon. So that's fantastic. But those weren't the conversations we were having at the bank. The conversations we were having at the bank were, how do we not have these types of litigations, right? How do we not have these types of demands? What is it that our employees need? What is it that our stakeholders need? What are they thinking about? What do they care about? And how do we address that? Regardless of whether there is a law or some sort of requirement or mandate, regulatory or not, how do we address these issues, because they are important. And so when I learned that Dave had somehow rallied these old school litigators to open up this ESG practice, I was extremely excited. And I thought it had, really played to my strengths and my experiences, and joined ESG as soon as I could when I got back to the firm in June. Since then, I've been helping corporate clients with their ESG commitments and policies, and making sure that their commitments match their internal operations and processes, still with the legal lens, right? Still making sure that they're not overcommitting or not digging into these things without this legal baseline, but also pushing them to do more and pushing them to understand that it's beyond what the legal requirements are.
That's great. Thank you so much. Interesting to hear about that background, Lisette and everybody. So drawing upon each of your backgrounds, particularly in the law and also the economic side. So as we know, in the last almost 4 years under the Trump administration, we've seen the dismantling of major climate policies and other policies, but at least 99 rollbacks of Obama era EPA regulations that governed everything from clean air to water and biodiversity. And of course, while the Biden administration is very likely to restore and probably accelerate many of those policies, it's going to take quite a bit of time for us to see any enforcement of regulatory compliance. So, in the absence of regulatory oversight of sustainability issues, I'm curious what your experience is in seeing companies relying instead on self-governance of these issues, and what does that integration of sustainability within corporate governance look like? Devry, why don't you start us off again?
Well, I think it's important to note, and I don't know all 99 of what you're talking about, but I will harken back to the election of 2016 and working with within my capacity around what do we say about climate change as it relates to sort of the rhetoric and the movement. And what I'll say is I'll remind folks, let's go back to the Wall Street Journal, the insert where company after company signed their company's name to continuing to commit to the Paris Accord. Now, I'm not entirely certain that every CEO understood the details of what that meant, but it was a broad message that we know and understand as the business community, we need to continue to move forward. We've already mapped these risks in our business and our supply chain, and we're already beginning to see the impacts as it relates to managing those risks. And so what I'll say is that there's been a huge swath of the business community who has been moving steadily forward and integrating, sustainability, I would say, especially on the environmental side, into their business strategy. Are they going above and beyond collectively? Some are, and I would say most are not. Most are beginning to move steadily toward what do we need to do to make sure we appease our stakeholders, we can continue to, make a return for our shareholders that is acceptable, et cetera. Where I think the opportunity comes in now is for businesses to live into the reality that whether it's a previous administration or now a Biden administration or an administration after that, we are slowly marching ourselves toward where we need to be in terms of self-regulation, but also regulation. And so I think the businesses, many have digested it. What I was interested in your poll, Kyla, and I just don't know because people only got to answer once, was the difference between the corporations and then you had mid-size. I don't know if folks caught that. If you're out in the audience, maybe you kind of struggled. Well, gee, I don't know. Where I think these regulations and reinserting them are going to create opportunity, but also challenge businesses on the small and medium enterprises. And that's where I'm hoping, and in fact, we've identified that when we started to segment customers, where do we think the big opportunity is? We think it is in the mid-manufacturer and the small manufacturers, because they're getting pressure now from those companies who have said, look, we're going to do this. We're demonstrating ESG. We're actually putting out integrated reports, not just financial, but doing integrated reporting across a whole set of metrics. I've had mid-sized businesses come and say, how do we handle this? Because we're getting sort of over-regulated. And I'd encourage all of us here to not take that as a resistance, but really we have an opportunity to say, okay, we want small businesses to thrive. We want medium-sized businesses to thrive, but they really are struggling with how do they meet some of these regulatory requirements. One, just digesting what they are, but two, then how do they integrate them in a way that they can actually, drive change. So I'm incredibly optimistic, and even though it's been a dark 4 years in this space of kind of ping-ponging around, and we know the outlier industries that have the work to do, and we know those industries and what they've been doing to interface with EPA to resist that. So those are the ones that are actually going to have to live into the reality. But the small and medium enterprises, I would say, as students in this space, take some time to focus in on that, because I don't believe it's resistance. I believe it's, at the end of the day, leaders of these businesses, when they're faced with what's the right thing to do, want to do the right thing.
I'll definitely cue off of that. Companies, the genie is out of the bottle for organizations. Laws and regulations are fence lines. They are not driving business behavior. And it's interesting to me that companies that resist laws actively. They lobby proactively against them, actually get the laws that they don't want. And the laws can be the excuse me, the laws can be the gravitational forces of that the stakeholders are driving. In the area of environmental, it was historically the government, state and federal in the US regulatory bodies were the things that everybody looked to, and whatever they did, they had to follow. Today, it was interesting in your poll, there wasn't anybody who thought the consumers drove change. And I would disagree with that because consumers and individuals, young girls from countries where they abuse women, don't educate women, can change the world overnight. And so I would fundamentally disagree. In fact, I think consumers and also business-to-business partners of companies are the ones that are driving the most significant change. And the government is sort of trying to play catch up with those progressive companies. And the facts are very simple. It's not, I don't think it's altruism. I think it's money. And when you see the inflows of money into ESG-based companies, so green-like companies, it's far exceeding inflows into companies that are not considered green. The indices of ESG in terms of investment are outperforming throughout COVID the regular investments by a wide margin. So that's the investor side. So investors influence and sometimes derive all the change in particular industries. There are pension funds and very large limited partnerships that invest in private equity and other investment vehicles that will not invest in certain types of companies anymore. It's not my opinion. It's not whether for me to judge it or for anybody else to judge it, but there are some, for example, that won't invest in coal, some in oil and gas. And when they won't invest in it, all of those money, the trillions of dollars, flow away from that and into other investment sectors. So we're seeing companies who in the past might have been poster child companies for doing the wrong thing, trying to be green and trying to move. So BP is a great example. Walmart has a leading program now in human rights and all sorts of social issues. Again, I'm not saying they're all perfect, but they're all moving in the direction. Walmart's the largest private employer in the world. And they have consumers, and the consumers are talking more and more to them. So I think it's this blend, the stakeholder community. The other, for students on trying to understand this very complex space of ESG and all of the language and acronyms and standards, is the drivers of business are quite simple. It's where the money flows, but also where risk will be contained. And so if you look at the very arcane world of reinsurance, which unless you're a specialist in that, it's unfathomable. Insurance and reinsurance drive most major decisions at companies, because if you can't pay for the risk side of it, if you can't get the downside protected, companies don't do it. And so we're seeing companies like Swiss Re and other reinsurance companies who are the ones that protect the insurance companies, refusing to invest in certain sectors, and they're driving ESG investments. We're seeing BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity. These are the largest investors in the world. None of us are them unless we're through their vehicles, and they are pushing for more change. Now, some of it's optics, but optics lead action at some point. Some of it will fall off, but I'm convinced, especially with COVID, I described this as the year the S hit the fan in ESG, and these social issues. You know, if companies think that they can contain what was traditionally HR stuff, diversity and inclusion, if they think they can contain issues like Black Lives Matter or having women in management on boards or people of color, they're wrong. These movements are not just social movements; they are movements within companies. Especially people in your generation, for the most part, in graduate programs, you're driving what employers are doing. And when I started and came out of law school, I didn't give a thought, to be perfectly honest, about what the employer was going to do for a work-life balance or any of these things. It wasn't part of the discourse. Today, it's front and center. People who come to our firm and into businesses where I've worked, they want to work for good companies that are doing what they perceive to be good things. And so I think those are the factors. We can talk a little bit later about how the law wraps around that. But the law is playing catch up, and if the world were waiting for the U.S. regulators to drive this, nothing would have happened by now. So we have the evidence, and so now it's leaning into it. And I think with the change in administration, as well as the state attorneys general and the like, you're going to see a push for this in the coming years. I mean, President-elect Biden has said his first issue, number one issue is climate change. So I don't think that's what we heard 4 years ago. And so one way or another, these forces, the gravitational forces, are moving in that direction.
I agree with everything that Devry and Dave have been saying, and I would add in terms of the self-governance point that, you know, one of my jobs is to just track the types of disclosures that companies have been making, and I've seen, you know, this sort of mad rush to publish ESG reports. There's no requirement to publish an ESG report. There's no law that says that they have to. But a bunch of these companies, I get these emails every day that says this company has published their first ESG report. And from experience, I've seen clients come to us and say, you know, we want to map onto, you know, these frameworks. How do we do that? How do we discuss the things that we are doing or want to do? How do we get on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, right? None of these things are necessarily imposed by, you know, the government or have some sort of legal mandate, but companies are calling us to try and get and do these things. And on the self-governance point, on the integration and what corporate governance looks like in this space, what I have seen in my short time working on all of these issues is that there's no one size fits all. So as you are thinking about what your role is going to look like in these spaces, I've seen committees within boards, right? I've seen ESG be handled by risk committees. I've seen ESG and sustainability issues be handled by task forces that then report to the board. But I think what should be top of mind is, you know, how do you, and this is sort of Dave's mantra, how do you track, measure, and monitor? And it doesn't sort of matter what the structure looks like as long as you have those things top of mind and are able to not only, you know, make commitments, but track them, measure them, monitor them, and be able to talk about where you're going.
That's great. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to just lump the next two questions together. So short-termism is one of the fundamental flaws of corporate governance that causes organizational short-sightedness in the battle for profits. How can companies incorporate long-term goals and growth without compromising their fiduciary responsibility to increase short-term profits for shareholders? And do incentives play a role in that? Lisette, actually, why don't you start us out?
Sure. Again, I don't have as much experience as Devry and Dave on this point, but I do fundamentally believe that incentives, starting with short-termism, so ESG is a long-term game, right? And that's sort of what I listen to Dave say in all of our calls. But obviously, and his, again, another one of his slogans is, you know, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But what we try to tell our clients is that prioritization is key in this space, and just the first thing companies need to do is figure out what is material, right? What do their stakeholders need? What really drives? What can really drive change in these spaces? And for that, we've always we have always tried to gear our clients to do stakeholder assessments, to really get under the hood on these things, because yes, it is long-term change, and sometimes those don't match up with incentives, right? But there is work to do here, and one can sorry, I'm like, I have all of these thoughts and I want to get them all out to you. Apologies. So for incentives, we need to make sure that they are sufficiently attractive to make a change, right? I think that there is a lot of trouble with getting to understanding what is a good incentive, what should we make our management and senior leadership be accountable for? And that is a very tough conversation to have because there is no guidance, there are no metrics. And that is why it's hard for me to have this discussion as I learn through this. It's probably gonna be hard for you all to have this discussion as you all learn through this and go through it. And every conversation is different. Some incentives work, some incentives don't work. I had a conversation with some friends in the financial industry where they were talking about how their companies just developed incentives and how not optimistic they were because they didn't have the right benchmarks, right? Or they didn't involve the right people that were actually going to do the work, or there wasn't a really good reporting structure so that these incentives could be really measured. And so I think this question is really hard. And as you can see with me sort of fumbling through this answer, there's a lot to think about. And as I get more experience, I think I'll better understand how these incentives can play a role and what short-term goals and how to balance short-term goals within a longer-term structure for ESG. But for now, I think this is as you can see, a really difficult question. So I'll kick it over to Dave.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Lisette. It is incredibly complex, but that doesn't mean, so good leadership at companies they need to demystify this whole area. It is not esoteric, it's hardcore business. It is, if you plan, the word sustainability means you're going to be around in a couple of years. And part of any business is you need to plan long-term, but have short-term increments that get you to that long-term gain. And so many businesses have forgotten that, and they work towards the quarter, and this is the EBITDA number, the sales number, whatever the market is looking for. Those companies don't thrive. If you look at the detritus of 2020 that has leveled companies, some of it has been that their industries have been completely devastated by COVID, and it's any company. The restaurant businesses, for example, these local mom and pop stores, there's nothing, they couldn't have done anything. Bigger companies like retailers, some are thriving and some are out of business. Why is that? Same basic principle. But some didn't adapt and adjust. Some highly leveraged their businesses so that they couldn't actually invest in anything sustainable. So you have the Targets of the world who are actually thriving, growing, paying more money to their employees, Walmart, and these kinds of companies. And you have the Sears and the JCPenney's that have, unfortunately, JCPenney invented and Sears invented retail. And those great brands didn't adjust and adapt. They also didn't address their consumer changes, as I mentioned earlier. And so you have to balance the short term with the long term. And I'm not saying this is easy. I've led businesses and there's a tremendous amount of pressure to deliver those results. But leaders have to have the courage to recognize that to be around in a year and 2 years and 3 years, they have to do things now. And so you're seeing companies like Microsoft and Starbucks making those investments that they need to make that are not going to pay off for years. In fact, they may never pay off for the business directly. Microsoft is going to be seeking to be carbon negative in 2030. They don't have to do that. It's not a legal requirement. And it likely isn't going to be a legal requirement. And it's 2020. That's 10 years from now, which means they're going to have to invest tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in the near term to have this end goal, which may not actually have a pure ROI. But Microsoft will be around. A lot of people predicted its demise about 20 years ago. And not only is it still around, it's thriving and it's a major player and it's growing. You have to have a discussion with your board. These companies have to do these things to say, get them in the right place. And if they're thinking short-termism, it's the wrong company. Those companies won't be around in all likelihood. And certainly those companies indexing to things that are not favorable from an ESG standpoint. So those, as I said, those market forces will play, and stakeholder demand is really critical. And so I think that you can do both. If you can't do everything at once, the thing that companies have done that has gotten them in trouble is hiding it. They need to be transparent about it and say, by the way, because in ESG, as I've said, there's no victory lap. You're never fully environmentally sound, you're never fully socially sound, and you're never fully governed with 100% perfection. These are goals. These are things you need to strive for. You never have the right amount of people of color and women in your company. You're always striving to get more. You're always trying to reduce your carbon and water usage and all these things. So I think the mistake that companies make is that they hide that information, especially if it doesn't look favorable, and then they get called out by a constituent, and then they're in trouble, and they're on their heels, and instead of being proactive and saying, you know what, we're not going to meet our target for 2025, but here's what our plan is to remediate and to address that. I don't know how you get hammered on that if you do it the right way and if you communicate it correctly. And that's where I mentioned earlier with Devry and the kinds of things where you're getting corporate communications together with legal, together with the other folks, the CFO, to say, here's our plan and here's how we're going to communicate it when we have dings to our plan, when there are shifts, when there are COVIDs. How do you adjust and adapt to these things? That's sound management.
Yeah. I would just add, and maybe there's a way for us to also kind of simplify this, because I think incentives, it's all about incentives. And when coming up as an economist, right? Like, we learn about what drives behavioral change, taxes, subsidies, limitations, regulations, etc. So let's just take that and translate that in-house within a business. Unless the business leaders have the right incentives, they will not make the change that is necessary. And I will say that there is one incentive, there is sort of an incentive where you've got a leader or a set of leaders who are incentivized by sort of the doing good, right? But then they face the reality of, well, gee, the way I'm being measured is on my short-term P&L or on my return on investment. And so this is where a huge body of work needs to be done. It's where we are experiencing at DevryBV Sustainable Strategies that taking an integrated approach to the change process is the right thing to do, where we help the businesses anticipate what's coming at them, what are those risks, but then build out that right internal alignment so that they can actually address those risks, not just in the short term, but take the long-term view. And I'll give you an example. One thing that's really important is to take a look and see, okay, so we've made a commitment as a company, let's just say, to end deforestation. Are the incentives in the right place with the people who are operating on the ground to say, you're not being measured on your quarterly growth of how much you're exporting, to X country, China, as it relates to soybeans or something else. What you're being measured on is whether you can do that without advancing any further deforestation, right? And so then how does the company place an incentive in place for that business leader? Because the business leaders are being rewarded based on what the expectations are of the leadership. So the internal incentives are really important. And what we are seeing is it's not just about like incentives around the P&L, but when we take a look at diversity, for example, how are we, in order for us to have a diverse enough mindset at the top so that we can call out ethical issues, so that we can address some of these longer term societal and environmental issues. Are we incentivizing, a way to get diverse leadership in? And I've seen some companies starting to say, look, executives' bonuses and their stock compensation will be tied to whether they have diverse leadership in the pipeline. It's important also at the board level. First of all, we believe there should be an assessment at the board level of whether there are climate deniers or not on that board. And if any board goes through and starts to assess that, that's a huge risk to the long-term business continuity of that company. So that's the first thing, is to make sure they're getting the right people with the right mindset on the boards. But then that they're having conversations with the boards around, do we need to reframe our expectations, for example, on return on investment? If we went from putting a business leader within the company on the hook for a 3-year, return on investment to a 4-year return on investment, how might that reshape whether that business leader is going to come and ask for approval for a sustainable investment? So really, it's about the board and the business leaders in conjunction with maybe the top leadership of the company saying, what is that journey we need to take to reframe the internal investments or internal incentives? It's all about internal incentives at the end of the day. And that kind of surprised us as a company. We've gone from just having this expertise on how we help the company manage the external stakeholder relations to helping companies understand what do we need to do to get not only the internal, the right sort of leadership intent, but the internal alignment so that they don't get caught within their own company on the misaligned incentives.
That's great. And Devry, you just kind of gave me a layup into my next question. So I'm going to come right back to you. And we're curious. So I've actually been asked this in an interview before, and my team and I were really interested to see what you all might say, which is that what have you said to somebody, be that maybe a member of the board or a manager, a client who doesn't believe in climate change? Do you try to change their opinion, or what do you say?
I've come along on my journey, in terms of, well, but of course you believe it too, actually asking just a host of questions. It's about, I've said it recently to one CEO who said, well, gee, you helped me walk across that bridge on sustainability. And I said, well, actually, no, you walked yourself across that bridge. And what's awesome about that is I approach it by asking a series of questions. So if somebody said to me, if a board member said to me, well, I don't believe in 2-foot sea level rise, or I don't, and these things really do happen. I take a step back and say, are you getting any pressure from your lenders? What are the, insurance companies talking to you about in terms of, the risks that they see, et cetera? Do you think that we will have a financial constraint on, capital allocation to the company? So being able to speak the language of business and put it back to people who are asking those gotcha questions really allows us to be able to move much further than coming at it from what we believe, what people will be able to say is, oh, you're just so altruistic, or you believe in a utopian society. Well, okay, fine, let's set that aside. Quite frankly, let's talk about this in the context of what risk we are creating for the business if we don't align behind some, the President-elect Biden's climate change initiatives, or if we don't unpack what the Paris Accord means for the business. If we quietly call those folks in our company, like, those are the ostriches. They have their heads in the sand. There's only so much work we will do to pull the ostriches out. The ostriches will be led there either through crisis or some kind of internal conflict that forces them to address it. There's a whole group of needy businesses in the middle where we can spend our time because they know they're needy and they know they need to do this. They just don't know how. So we'll ask the right questions. I'm not out to convince somebody who's an existentialist in this space that climate change is real. I'm out to convince business to do the right thing for the long-term health of their business, but for the long-term health of our economy and our planet. So, that's where we come out on it.
Yeah, and I would just jump in to dovetail with that, which is I don't have to believe in any of it. It's irrelevant what I believe. I don't have to believe in gravity. I'm still going to fall down if I don't hold myself up. The forces of the market believe it. So whether it's real or not, and I would think if you're a person who lives in the western part of the United States, you'd realize that climate change is a reality. Or if you live in the coastal cities and areas in the U.S., it's a reality. But the reality is that, as Lisette mentioned before, the forces around your clients, your stakeholders, your supply chain, your employees, investors are requiring change here. So it's not your vote anymore. It's not voluntary. You have to make the change. And that's, there are a lot of things I have to do I don't like Lisette used to bill. She actually bills her time in 6-minute increments at our firm. I can guarantee you no lawyers like to do it. It's a fact of reality. So don't go to a law firm if you don't want to do that. If you're joining any mid-market company or a larger company and you are working in an area where you have environmental impact, there are things you have to do. You have to document things, you have to have policies, you have to have procedures, you have to track, measure, and monitor, as Lisette mentioned. And It's a free country, I think, still. And so don't work there, but you're going to find it harder and harder and harder to find an organization that isn't leaning into this, and not only doing what the regulations require, but going well beyond it, because they realize that it's for the benefit of their company, their employees, and for their communities. And so if I were there, arguing it is irrelevant. You got to move forward. Your company is going to have to do things. You have to report to boards, even if you're a large private company. I know, Devry, you work for I think the largest private company in the US. These large companies and mid-market companies are mimicking what publicly traded companies do. They're catching up, they're disclosing because they need money, they need investment, they need bank loans, they need also things. So if you think about, I mentioned risk before, banks, they're not lending now to companies with high risk profiles. That's a driver. If you can't get a loan or you can't fund things, so it doesn't matter if your CEO doesn't believe in it, they're not going to get the loan. I gave up worrying about my belief system a long time ago. At the end of the day, do you align with the organization you're part of to drive things? And at the end of the day, these things drive better results, and the incentive is there. If you want to make profits, that's how you do it. If you want to disincentivize bad behaviors, you have to do that so that you can mitigate the risks of the upside of your company. We haven't talked about it at all, but there are companies that are thriving in this market with environmentally forward policies. I mean, Tesla was at one point the highest valued company in the world, and it hasn't really turned a profit. Why is that? Because they love the founder who doesn't believe in a lot of interesting things? No, because the vehicles are battery operated and they're not emitting carbon. And people realize that that's the future. The Mustang has an all electric vehicle coming out for consumers to drive and buy.
David, do you mind if you and I toggle, and Lisette and I toggle back and forth for a second? You raised a point earlier on consumers and where consumers are taking us. I mean, this is something I was surprised that consumers weren't listed. What we also say is citizen movements. It goes beyond just consumers, that companies are now looking at the citizen movements and saying these movements are actually driving governments to make change. So there's a lot of power in whether the consumer wants to buy your product or not, which is why we've seen consumer branded companies and places like the Consumer Goods Forum way out front on things like deforestation or issues in the supply chain as it relates to human rights, because the brands are on the front lines. I find that compelling, because now all the suppliers are having to catch up, and then they turn to the small suppliers. And so it's like the consumer brands and the consumer activity is driving change. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I would love just to make sure we don't leave without highlighting that important point.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And as someone who's just starting to have these conversations with companies, I did sort of brace for that question or that comment, and being stuck in a Zoom with a climate change denier. But I haven't had those conversations, honestly. It hasn't been. I know I was actually very surprised. Maybe it's because I'm a millennial. Unclear, but I haven't had those conversations. People aren't talking about their individual beliefs. People are talking about, what investors are doing and what consumers are doing. They're like, I don't want to be the subject of some sort of Twitter campaign or Instagram campaign that, messes up my entire business. I don't want to be part of cancel culture. I don't want to be part of any of these new sort of millennial hashtags. I want to stay away from that. I want to, sort of do as much good as I can that makes us financially still viable, and stay away from all of that. So I've seen, in the initial conversations that I've been having with clients, it isn't about individual beliefs. It's really about what the market is saying, what consumers are saying, what investors are saying, and how they can best disclose what they're doing and what they want to do.
We did just have a
interrupting,
David, but you made that point early on, and I didn't think we fleshed that out as much.
No, you're exactly right. It's the movements are giant symptoms of larger problems. What we're seeing now is the companies are channeling those movements to reality. Whether they like them or not. Nobody likes having protesters outside of your front door. I don't care what company you're at. but so they want them at the very least, if their goal is to get them away from the door, so be it. Whatever their motivation, I don't really care about it. They're doing the right things to get to placate and to address these issues. And at a certain point, there's no, as I said, the genie's out of the bottle. These movements are here to stay. People have the microphone. They have social media. They can put a company out of business in a week. And that power didn't exist. So I think the consumer and these movements and these political protests and the like are just going to grow and grow.
So we just have a couple minutes left. I did have one question just come into the chat. And that is, what are your thoughts on corporates engaging with policymakers on issues like climate change? So think, for example, series and related think tanks or NGOs. Is this a wise use of corporate resources? And should more companies engage in this? And I know you've had some experience with this, Devry, so I'm going to ask you to answer this question in just a minute or so.
So the question is whether corporates should engage with policymakers and think tanks. Yes, absolutely. I mean, corporates should engage with all stakeholders, and they have the ability to really drive the policy agenda. What I would say, however, is as they're doing that, or even before they do that, they get the real ground truth from what their other stakeholders are thinking, feeling, expecting. So we're big on, spending time. I mentioned citizen movements. That companies get very local in their conversations at the community level with what the expectations are of the citizen, and get a holistic view, not just their own siloed view on what's going to help the company, but broadly what's going to broadly help stakeholders. So this notion of stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism is really important if companies are then going to engage at the policy level, the political level, and trying to drive that policy change through the system.
Any final thoughts on that, Lisette or Dave?
Yeah, I think the head in the sand that you mentioned before, Devry, is exactly right. You have to be engaging. What you don't want is a street fight that's public with people who are there. Putting your head in the sand is a mistake. And you, as I mentioned earlier, you'll get the laws that you don't want if you don't engage the policymakers and lawmakers in advance. I have 1,000 examples of it. Most regulations and laws are compromised and they're terrible, and the companies resultingly have to deal with these hodgepodge of things that are poorly crafted. We advise our clients to engage ahead of time and at least be aware of what risk is coming to them so that they can plan accordingly. Just ignoring them, NGOs who drive a lot of the legislative and regulatory agendas is a mistake. You don't do it at your peril. They have the microphone and they are driving laws and policies. And so, if I were companies, I'd get in right now, I'd be talking with the Biden administration, because if they don't, they won't be heard and their views won't be on the table. So
that's great. Thank you. And as we near the top of the hour, that will conclude today's event. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Dave, Lisette, and Devry, so much for joining us for this timely conversation. I can only speak for myself, but these helped answer some unanswered questions that I've been thinking about throughout the course of my sustainability studies. So we sincerely appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Good luck to all the students.
Good luck to the students. Yeah.
Yeah, good luck to you all. Thanks for your leadership. You are the future leaders of industry, government, civil society. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. And I just want to say, for more information on SUMASA's initiatives, such as our annual spring symposium, you can visit our website at sumasa.org, or you can reach out to us at sumasaboard@sumasa.org.